So today we'll be talking about parties in America. So this will be about the political parties in the United States. And of course, that's important this time of year because of the election. But first thing I want to mention is when it comes to political parties of the United States would be organization. And a lot of people forget about this because they like to complain about the parties and all they care about is winning and they're corrupt and they just try to get money. But the important thing to remember is the purpose of a political party is they would like to create public policy or law. So they would like to create public policy by winning elections because that's the only way they can actually pass laws is if they win elections. If they can't do that, then they can't make any laws. And a lot of people fail to understand that. They'll complain, oh, they just seem to care about winning. Well, yes, that's because they have to do that first. And a lot of people will say, well, they don't take a radical enough approach. Well, if they do that, then of course they're going to scare away voters. So a lot of what goes on when it comes to controversy involving parties is just a misunderstanding. The only way that they can actually get anything done is by first winning elections. And so most of their organization is built around that. Each party has committees or groups of people at the local, state, and national level. Crawford County, Warren County, Forest County, Venango County each have their own Republican and Democratic Party committees. And starting there, they try to get locally elected officials elected. So, for instance, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party in Crawford County next year will try to get people lined up to run for offices like county auditor and district attorney and township supervisors and other stuff like that. Because the only way you can get people to run for higher office is if first they gain some type of experience at the lower level. And plus, the more elections you can win, the more energized people get and the more people that want to sign up for your party, which guarantees you'll have more voters to rely on later on. At the state level, of course, they need to coordinate their activities because that's where a lot of public policy occurs, at the state legislature. And so they need to get people elected to the state house, there are 203 seats altogether, and the state senate where there are 50 seats. And of course, the big seat that matters the most, or at least gets the most attention, would be the governor's election. And so the state needs to concentrate on gathering candidates that are viable, that can run for office and win those various seats. And then, of course, there's the national level. There's the Democratic National Committee and the Republican National Committee. And both these organizations, headquartered in Washington, D.C., raise hundreds of millions of dollars a year in order to spread out to the various states, but also help get people elected to the federal offices like the House and the Senate and the presidency. The head of each of these organizations is usually the party chairperson, and usually they're the most powerful person in the party unless the president happens to be from the same party. Then whomever the party chairperson is just going to go along with whatever the president wants. For instance, right now, the president is Donald Trump, and he's a Republican, so the RNC chair is just going to basically do what he wants. But each of these organizations has to involve tens of thousands of volunteers and hundreds of employees because they need to keep working all the time because, for instance, the House is up for election every 2 years. So once they get elected, they have to start raising money for the next time that they're going to be up for election. And so this constant revolving door of elections means that these organizations have to have permanent people there that know what they're doing. They know how to get the word out. They know how to advertise. They know how to solicit donations, and so on. Next thing I want to mention would be types of parties. There are, of course, the two main parties, and in every country you usually have a conservative party that is interested in smaller government but protecting values and security. And that, in our case, would be the Republican Party. And then you usually have a more liberal party or party on the left, for instance, that believes in more government involvement in the economy, but restriction from private matters. And once again, right here, that would be the Democrats. In every country, you have at least one big party that meets into one of those two categories. And then you also have third parties or minor parties that fall into various types of categories. One would be an ideological party, a party that basically has some type of philosophy behind their way of thought. For instance, libertarians believe in keeping government as small as possible. They don't like laws that Democrats propose, and they don't like laws that Republicans propose. Or another example would be the Socialist Party, based on the teachings of Karl Marx. So those would be ideological parties. You have splinter parties, parties that break off from one of the bigger ones. In 1912, Teddy Roosevelt wanted to run for election again because he didn't believe his successor, President Taft, was liberal enough. It wasn't progressive enough. And so he ran for the Republican nomination, but didn't get it. And so instead, he decided to break off and form his own party, the Bull Moose Party. And even though this sounds like a good idea, all that it ends up doing is splitting the bigger group. And so obviously in that case in 1912, the Republicans and Teddy Roosevelt did not win the election. The Democrats did instead with Woodrow Wilson. And then there are one-issue parties, parties that only concentrate on one thing, like the Prohibition Party. Obviously, the only thing they cared about was getting that constitutional amendment in. And when the 18th Amendment passed, they could all just go away and never have to worry about politics again. But of course, then the 21st Amendment passed, repealing that. So believe it or not, today there still is a Prohibition Party. They like to get it back in the Constitution again to make alcohol, at least the sale and distribution of it, illegal. And so those type of parties exist as well. And there are economic parties. These are parties that just care about money issues. So you often see taxpayers groups formed that are obviously concerned about particular issues like taxes, for instance, and government spending. So those are different types of parties. In the United States, if you remember from the first unit, George Washington, for instance, he didn't like the idea of parties, but really they already started while he was there. There are already groups that favored those two different views. One that wanted bigger government, one that wanted smaller government, for instance. And it started with, of course, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. And so even going back to the Founding Fathers generation, we've had political parties. The two that we have today, the Democrats and Republicans, didn't really start until a little bit later, though. The Democrats began when they broke off from that Democratic-Republican Party. Andrew Jackson formed the Democrats in the mid-1820s. And it became the first formal political party in the world, the first one to employ people and to get volunteers and to print propaganda. And because of that, he was able to solidify a lot of support, especially in the South and also cities on the East Coast. Then eventually the Republican Party formed, a completely different one than part of that one that I just mentioned, by 1856. And the Republican Party, its main purpose really in starting was to stop the spread of slavery. Not necessarily end it, but stop the spread of it. But both of these parties, of course, took opposite positions, especially with 1860 and the election of Abraham Lincoln. The Republicans backed a lot more government programs to get involved in the economy, to stop slavery, and then to help the newly freed slaves at the end of the Civil War, and to push through the constitutional amendments that existed, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And then the Democrats basically favored smaller government, concentrating on the states, and obviously they supported slavery and then eventually segregation after that. So they were the more conservative party. The Republican Party were the more liberal ones. And that changed in the 1920s. Woodrow Wilson had been president during World War I, and the government was very involved. And so once that wound down, the Republicans needed to run something again. So they said, why don't we go back to normal where we weren't involved in the world? We didn't have a lot of government programs. So the Republican Party started to go back toward the conservative side, and the Democrats started to go more toward the liberal side. So in the 1920s, the two big parties switched positions. And so Democrats went from being conservative to liberal, and Republicans went from being liberal to conservative. Because once one started to switch, the other one has to take the opposite position on things. And so they both ended up flip-flopping in the meantime. Now, that isn't to say it was that way throughout the entire party. There would be groups of people in both parties that kind of went with either end of the political spectrum. And so it took quite a while for everyone to make that switch over. And so today, the Republican Party still stands for smaller government when it comes to the economy. They don't like getting involved too much in telling businesses what to do. They're less likely to favor raising the minimum wage, less likely to favor environmental laws, but also less likely to tax people heavily because they believe many people should keep the money in order to do with what they want. They're also more likely to believe in national security and law and order to an extent that they favor, for instance, well, at least not President Trump, but other Republicans have favored taking a more heavy hand against terrorism and other things like that. The president obviously favors a more isolationist point of view. And then the Democrats favor more economic intervention, laws to protect workplace safety and protect the environment, raise the minimum wage, and they believe in heavier taxes, especially on the wealthy. And so those two different points of view are taken by the parties. There's, of course, more of this in the second unit, talking about where those parties stand today. And that will be on display even more so during this election. Does anybody have any questions?